Against a clear blue sky, the majestic white fortress of Lungle stood tall with its blue-capped spires overlooking distant mountains, where an unseen speaker asked Lloyd Bluegust Lungle if he was absolutely certain about committing to a forbidden high-risk gotcha pull. The king gave a heavy-hearted nod, authorizing the high-stakes summon because they were fresh out of options. Right on cue, a blinding magic circle flared to life between the massive white pillars of the summoning chamber, and a hand reached out of the radiating magical heat. Meanwhile, back in the boring real world, heavy rain was drumming against the window of a modern high school building, where our incredibly average protagonist, Usato Ken, muttered about the downpour. He watched the raindrops slide down the glass, admitting to himself that his life wasn't terrible. But as he sat on the tiled hallway floor, looking completely disconnected, he couldn't help but wish for a fantasy world escape to break the monotonous routine. His flat, expressionless face remained unchanged as he mentally complained that he'd use magic just to avoid getting wet. But the narrator quickly called him out on his lazy daydreaming. Looking at the students huddling under the eaves to avoid the rain, Usato wished for something dramatic to happen. Suddenly, a high school girl with short hair gasped to her friend that the student council's top 2 royalty figures had arrived. Usato immediately sized up the male specimen, Ryusen Kazuki, recognizing him as the perfect, handsome class vice president, and internally wished the guy would just explode already. Standing next to him was the council president, Inukami Suzune, a flawless, legendary beauty who was entirely out of a regular NPC's reach. Usato wondered if the rumors about them dating were true, but he quickly looked away, deciding it was none of his business. That's when Suzune broke the fourth wall of his isolation, turning her analytical gaze toward him to ask if he lacked an umbrella. Usato jumped in surprise, stammering a confused reply. Kazuki, acting like a textbook righteous hero, immediately offered to lend him his own umbrella. Usato stared at it with wide, stunned eyes, asking if it was really okay. Kazuki flashed a friendly smile, insisting they use first names since they were classmates. Usato bashfully agreed, prompting Suzune to lean in and ask if she could call him by his name too. Kazuki beamed, instantly melting Usato's skepticism about popular kids. The poor guy suffered a comedic emotional overload, screaming internally that the prettiest girl in school calling him by name meant he could die happy. Suzune smiled, leading the way out into the storm. As the three walked down the rainy city street, Kazuki asked Usato about his graduation plans, to which Usato deflected, asking Suzune instead. Suzune giggled, admitting she hadn't decided either, which shocked Usato since she was a third year. She stared ahead with a blank gaze, explaining that she effortlessly aces every goal she sets. Walking ahead under her umbrella, she confessed she often felt like a misfit. Catching herself, she turned back to clarify she wasn't trying to humble brag. Usato softened, offering some genuine empathy, which earned him a warm look from the president. Seizing the moment, Usato awkwardly asked if the two were secretly dating, causing Suzune to point at Kazuki in total confusion. They both immediately denied it, explaining they only hung out due to student council duties. Usato squinted suspiciously, but Kazuki defensively tried to deny the relationship. That's when Suzune paused, and Kazuki asked what was wrong. A mysterious gong echoed in the air, prompting Usato and Suzune to look around in confusion, while Kazuki stood there completely deaf to it. Suddenly, a massive magic circle erupted on the wet pavement, causing Usato to lean back in shock, while the student council duo stared down at the glowing glyphs. "A magic circle?" Usato yelled. "What the?" Suzune shouted. Kazuki was in total disbelief, asking if they were on a prank show. As the light intensified, Usato realized the truth and screamed that they were being isekai'd. Kazuki was utterly bewildered, while Suzune yelled Usato's name. But instead of panicking, Suzune's face twisted into an expression of manic unhinged excitement as she realized magic and heroes were real. Usato stared at her in complete disbelief, while Kazuki looked utterly exhausted by her sudden personality shift. As a blinding flash of light consumed them, Usato's final thought was that he was actually going to get along great with this secret weirdo. Inside the grand, white-tiled summoning chamber of Lungle Castle, the blinding flash receded, leaving Usato to slowly blink open an eye against the hard floor. Kazuki was already pushing himself up, staring in utter bewilderment at the massive pillars, while Usato stirred and Suzune lay motionless nearby. Kazuki leaned forward to check if Usato was okay. Usato sat up, completely disoriented by the blue-capped spires, and asked about their eccentric president. Suzune finally sat up to check for injuries, but her voice was drowned out as a booming, authoritative voice announced their awakening. The trio knelt on the white floor, and someone screamed, demanding to know who was speaking. A close-up revealed a man with a large, well-groomed blonde mustache, speaking in a solemn tone. It was none other than Lloyd Bluegust Lungle, the king of Lungle. Usato glanced at a nearby official, internally admitting he had never heard of this place in any of his gaming databases. The king leaned forward with a stern, serious look. He got straight to the point, declaring they had been summoned as legendary heroes, which caused Suzune's eyes to gleam with terrifying joy as she cheered that her time had finally come. Usato could only blink in confusion, a giant sweat drop forming on his head at her unhinged reaction. Even Suzune paused, looking slightly puzzled by her own outburst. The king explained that the Demon King had revived and was invading, and after barely surviving an attack 2 years ago, they resorted to summoning otherworldly heroes with specialized attributes. He admitted with a heavy heart that they used a forbidden technique out of sheer desperation. Suzune burst into a fit of loud, energetic laughter, forcing Usato to recoil in absolute disbelief. The king stood there looking guilty, while Suzune laughed so hard she completely shattered her elegant student council president archetype. Usato, trying to salvage some logic, asked about the summoning requirements, and the king explained that the magic circle targets specific hero attributes, which triggers a bell sound. Suddenly, Suzune and Kazuki gasped in realization. Kazuki looked deeply worried, pointing out that Usato was the only one who hadn't heard the bell. A blonde knight gasped in shock as the king yelled in disbelief, realizing they had accidentally kidnapped an innocent bystander. Usato stood frozen, staring at his sneakers as the crushing dread set in. The king rubbed his forehead in extreme stress, apologizing that the summoning was a one-way trip and they couldn't send him back. He offered a somber apology for ruining the kid's life. That's when Kazuki snapped, screaming that this was absolute bullshit. Kazuki gestured wildly, yelling about their loved ones waiting at home, while Usato tried to calm him down. The king, standing in his fur-trimmed cloak, solemn and desperate, begged them to lend their strength to protect his world. He promised he would search for a way to return them. Then, the monarch shocked everyone by dropping to the floor and bowing deeply. The boys stood rigid, sweat drops on their faces. Kazuki looked over at his companions, his brow furrowed in anxiety. They stood behind the massive, cloaked figure of the bowing king. The king's face was obscured by shadows, and Kazuki sweated as he struggled with the choice. "I understand. Please raise your head," Kazuki finally agreed, playing right into the standard fantasy protagonist script. The king raised his head in gratitude. Meanwhile, Suzune was back to laughing silently with a broad smile, prompting Usato to realize that the president was enjoying this fantasy nightmare way too much. He stared at her, completely exasperated. In the castle's glowing aptitude measurement room, Welsie, the court-assigned mage with glasses, welcomed them with a warm smile. She gestured toward an ornate pedestal holding a crystal ball, explaining that touching it would reveal their magical element. She gave a quick tutorial on basic elements like fire, water, and lightning, as well as utility magic. Wellesley then invited Kazuki to go first, catching the popular guy off guard. Kazuki stepped forward hesitantly, with a sweat drop on his cheek. The moment he touched the sphere, a blinding white light erupted, making Usato and Suzune gasp. Wellesley beamed with professional pride, announcing he wielded the ultra-rare light element. Kazuki stared at his hand, questioning if he was just supposed to blind people with flashbangs. Suzune went full anime weeb, waving her arms and yelling that he should fire lasers or summon a giant light sword. Usato sighed heavily, pressing his hand to his forehead to stop Kazuki from taking her literally, internally complaining that the president had been acting incredibly dangerous since they arrived. He turned to yell at her, while she just smiled smugly, completely unfazed by his sanity checks. Wellesley recorded the data, explaining that the light element is the ultimate anti-demon weapon, reserved only for the chosen few. Suzune stepped up next with absolute confidence, and Wellesley invited her to try. The moment the president touched the crystal, it crackled with electrical energy and glowed bright yellow, prompting Wellesley to announce she possessed massive mana pools and a lightning element. Suzune smiled in triumph, while Usato offered a warm, supportive remark. Finally, Usato stepped up, hesitantly asking if he could get his stats checked too. But the second his hand made contact, a massive eruption of emerald green light exploded from the sphere, causing Suzune and Kazuki to admire the pretty gem-like color. Usato tilted his head, naively wondering if green meant he could control plants or play a druid build. Suddenly, Wellesley's face turned pale blue with pure, unadulterated horror as she clutched her chest, prompting Usato to ask what was wrong. Instead of answering, Wellesley panicked, lunged forward, and bolted out the door at sonic speed to report the catastrophic news, leaving Usato yelling in utter confusion. Inside the king's private office, Lloyd and his advisor are suddenly startled by a violent crash at the door. Wellesley bursts into the room in a state of utter hysteria, screaming the king's name. The king demands to know if she has the aptitude results, while Wellesley points back at the students, specifically at a heavily bandaged and exhausted Usato. The king's face falls as the room's atmosphere turns incredibly heavy. He nervously asks if Usato rolled something cursed, like dark magic. Wellesley drops the bombshell. The crystal glowed green. She confirms Usato is a rare healing magic user, sending the king stumbling back in absolute shock. Usato sits up, completely clueless about why healing is a big deal. Wellesley explains that while basic mages can apply minor status condition cures, real healing magic is an ultra-rare cheat skill. The king breaks into a cold sweat, muttering that they must hide Usato because that person cannot find out about his build. Right on cue, panicked knights smash open the doors, screaming that Captain Rose is requesting an audience. The staff immediately loses their minds, telling Usato to hide. A blonde knight grabs Usato to stuff him into a hiding spot before Rose finds him. Too late. An overwhelmingly terrifying presence enters, and Rose steps into the room. Clad in a military field uniform, her long, reddish-brown hair commands instant authority. She asks if the heroes have arrived, her eyes instantly locking onto the group. She notes the sweating king, who nervously claims Rose should be on her day off. Rose just smirks, smiles, and dismisses the concept of rest. She looms over Usato, bluntly demanding to know who he is. The king frantically lies, claiming Usato is just a useless, unlucky civilian who got dragged along. Rose towers over the trembling boy, demanding his name, and Usato stammers it out. She grins like a predator, introducing herself as leader of the Kingdom Rescue Squad. Usato screams in terror that she looks like a high-level assassin. Rose ignores him, while Kazuki and Suzune rush over, asking Usato if he's okay. The king desperately points to them, identifying them as the true heroes. Rose inspects them, noting they have decent stats. But then Kazuki, completely oblivious to the danger, asks why Wellesley freaked out and dragged Usato away the moment his crystal turned green. The room goes dead silent. Rose's face shadows over, repeating, "Green, you say?" While Usato's soul leaves his body. Usato lets out a blood-curdling scream. In a split-second blur of speed lines, Rose snatches him, throws him over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, and announces she's borrowing him. The king frantically screams for her to wait, but the two heroes can only watch in stunned silence as their friend is kidnapped in broad daylight. Fast forward to the chaotic streets outside the castle, where Rose flashes a sadistic grin, promising to train Usato into a prime-tier healer. She vanishes in a mock-speed blur, leaving Kazuki eating her dust, while the king cries out in vain. Kazuki desperately chases her, shouting that Usato is a civilian, but he's completely outmatched by her speed. Back in the throne room, Suzune sighs, and Wellesley collapses on the floor, explaining that Rose runs the terrifying rescue squad. We cut to Rose marching toward her isolated base, with Usato still draped over her shoulder. Wellesley's voiceover explains that while standard healers only do basic first aid, true healing magic is a critical battlefield resource. A senior knight warns the heroes that Rose's training methods are borderline illegal. The king shudders, and the senior knight awkwardly hesitates, admitting her training is pure hell. Wellesley points out a nearby elite knight curled up in a traumatized fetal position, while another breaks out in a cold sweat of pure PTSD. Suzune notes even the top-tier guards are crying. The senior knight tells them Rose's history is too dark to discuss, claiming normal humans can't survive her, which is why no one dared to stop her. He explains that during the demon invasion, her squad carried the entire kingdom on their backs, meaning her results are undeniably effective. Suzune and Kazuki exchange worried glances, praying for Usato's survival. Smash cut to the rescue squad's isolated mountain outpost. Usato gets dumped on the pavement, tripping over his own feet as Rose declares they've arrived. Usato sits on the floor, looking up at Rose in absolute dread. He takes in the quiet entryway and tries to convince himself it's just a normal hospital. Suddenly, the floorboards shake as a wall of massive, scarred muscle heads surrounds him. Usato screeches, assuming he's being raided by high-level bandits. Instead, the meat shields roar a welcoming salute to Rose, leaving Usato in a state of sweating shock. Rose asks for status reports as Usato realizes these giant bouncers call her Big Sis. Usato shrieks in terror, and Rose introduces him as her new recruit, ignoring Usato's internal screams of "no thanks." The squad introduces themselves. Tong, Meal, Alec, Gomo, and Gould. Trapped by the intimidating wall of muscle, Usato's face distorts into absolute dread as he stammers an apology. Rose suddenly blows him back with an explosive entrance, telling the boys to stop scaring him, though Usato screams that she is the real final boss. Rose explains the squad are non-magic tanks who retrieve the wounded, while he will be the primary healer. She promises to personally teach him the ropes, and when Usato hesitates, she barks at him until he screams "yes" in terror. She schedules training for tomorrow and assigns him to Tong's room. Tong nods silently and leads Usato down the dark corridor into a sparse bedroom. Usato is shocked to find a normal-looking setup. He formally addresses Tong, but the bald giant tells him to drop the formalities. Usato starts to reply as Tong hands him 3 sets of training gear. Tong walks over to his cot, then casts a terrifying shadow, grinning that tomorrow will be literal hell. Usato screams in panic. Tong explains the absolute horror of the healer class. Since Usato can instantly heal his own fatigue and broken bones, he can be forced to train endlessly without breaks. Usato shudders, realizing his own cheat skill is a curse, and Tong explains that healers are usually treated as talentless squishies. Usato gets a micro-flashback to his gaming days, where healers are always targeted first. Tong admits he used to think the same, then abruptly cuts the chat to sleep. Usato demands to know what he meant by used to, but Tong roars at him to shut up and sleep. Usato flops onto his bed, annoyed by Tong's loud snoring. He stares at the ceiling, realizing healing magic and hellish training are a terrifying combination. Outside, the squad building stands silent under a giant, ominous full moon, leaving Usato to dread his imminent doom.
The video ends here, but the story isn't over yet. Like the video if you're ready for the next part.